As Belinda mentioned, this is a relatively informal session, so looking to get feedback as we go. We'll have some kind of natural pauses through, which would be a good chance to address any of the questions that come through, and just looking forward to stepping you through it. Oh, and also we'll be providing this as a PDF back to Belinda at the end of the session, so it can be circulated. So don't worry about taking notes of anything that's on the screens. Okay. Now, let's kick off. Kate, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I think that would be really good. Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity, everybody. Just adding a little bit to those introductions. Basically, when it comes to this topic, Cassandra's the brains and I'm the brawn. I'm sitting here at a chuka, looking out. I can see from here, can't quite see the river as in the water, but I can see the tree line, and I just want to acknowledge the Yorta Yorta people, which is the mob whose land that we hang out on, and I get reminded every day of that heritage because I've got a couple of cracking scar trees on our property, which is good. And carbon, Cass, carbon.
Oh, look, it's really the bit of a word at the moment, isn't it, Kate? And really, so what we'd like to talk through this morning is really about what the whole emission space looks like in ag at a very, very basic level. And then what does that mean in terms of the carbon trading space and net zero and supply chain reporting, which is kind of the three big ticket items at the moment. There's a lot of talk about net zero as a concept, so we'll go through what that looks like and why it's important. And what does this mean really in terms of farming activities, our practices and future strategies. So just really setting up for what some options that farmers can start to think about and just start to future-proof your strategies for the future. And Kate, I think that last comment there is something that I do believe you're a bit of an expert on.
Yes. Well, I guess, the farmers are the expert at preparing with and acting on incomplete information. And I think that's a challenge, particularly for the scientists, because they like to have exact answers. But the reality is we'll have some decisions to make and there'll be incomplete information, but we're used to thinking about scenarios and then making a call. Like we do it every season. So I don't see this as any different, really. So I'm fairly relaxed about the whole job, to be honest.
So it's really about what we'll go through this morning is just setting up a few of the guideposts that you can kind of work in and kind of what your activity focus needs to look like, just to make sure that you're basically in the game for when all that needs to
absolutely
kick off. All right, so let's kick off with a bit of nerdy science stuff. Really just context.
I'll give this one to you, Cass.
Oh shucks, Kat, thanks. So don't worry about reading all the detail on this slide. It's we'll send it through as well. But really, just the key thing to consider is at the moment agriculture is getting a bit of a flogging in terms of the emission space, and as is most industries. The key thing is that a lot of the emissions that come out from the ag sector per se, a lot of those are actual natural processes. So it's not like by doing farming as such, we've changed the whole scope of the landscape, we've changed that whole emission profile. We've shifted some of the levers that are involved, but certainly if we were to stop activity on farm tomorrow, a lot of these processes would continue to happen. So that's a really key point, is a lot of these are somewhat outside of our control and some of them are in our control. So it's really around focusing what the key levers are that are in our control and understanding what all that looks like. So really just focusing on some of the things that are relevant for irrigated cropping farmers and mixed farming enterprises. It's really around these three types of gases. So we talk about nitrous oxide. That's a gas that is considered really harmful because of its high global warming potential. So every unit of nitrous oxide has 310 times the warming potential of carbon dioxide. So it's a small part of the system, but it's something that can have big impact. Then we look at carbon dioxide, which is kind of our classic greenhouse gas, and that's really around microbial activity, plant decay, and kind of general processes on farm. So this comes into play somewhat when we do burning, but we don't really account for the carbon dioxide loss through burning because it's come from photosynthesis in the first place. So the plant stores it and then it releases it again. But really the key thing to think about with carbon dioxide is that just like us, all the microbes in the soil, most of the ones that we actually like to have, actually breathe in oxygen like us, and they breathe out CO2. So that's why the microbial activity and the soil per se has a big deal to play in terms of this CO2 story. So obviously photosynthesis is how plants capture CO2, and so that's really where the role of trees and biomass in the whole carbon capture space comes into play. So it's about taking that carbon dioxide out of the environment into those plants. To some degree, also the accumulation of organic matter in the soil and residues into that have a role to play in the CO2 as well. The challenge we have with that though is that's not a complete perfect process because of that microbial activity and the fact that as microbes break down residues, they then actually release CO2 back into the atmosphere as part of that. So that's kind of why we talk about CO2. When it comes to the carbon trading space and the accounting world in terms of emissions, everything's reported as CO2 equivalents. So that's why when any of you have had any reports done, it's all about CO2e in that space, which brings everything back to a common factor. And then for the mixed farmers, methane is obviously important because of its role in global warming as well, and the fact that it's a key trigger out of animal production. And obviously this is a space that there's been a lot of interest in over the last few years, and looking at ways that we can reduce that. So I guess the key message is there's a lot of different triggers in our systems. There's only a few major triggers, and if we can just focus on what's important in that space and not to basically acknowledging that there's a large portion of that which is outside of our activity kind of control. Kate, any more you'd like to add on that one? We'll go through a bit more about the key triggers in.
No, I think that's the main thing, to understand that the reporting comes in carbon dioxide equivalents, but those in animal agriculture, methane's the big one, and not nitrous oxide is a big one in terms of fertilizer use. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much the summary. Cass?
Yeah. So I guess the key thing I see from this point is the fact that there's a lot of our emissions are actually related to residues and how we deal with our residues in our system. Kate, anything else you'd like to comment?
Yeah, look, I threw this slide in, and really it's about different soil type differences. These are some of the soil types I've worked on, in my career. We've got everything there from non-wetting sands in the top left corner at Esperance. The bottom left corner is the dark, beautiful vertisols up in the Darling Downs. And then the photo in the middle is typical red duplex soils in southern New South Wales. We've got so much natural variability in soils, which ultimately determines how much carbon a soil can hold. And that's something that the market itself probably doesn't have a great awareness of. So this stuff, it's complex and complicated, and we just need to be aware of that.
So it's really about understanding the limitations and thresholds in your systems And just because you read in a glossy brochure somewhere about a target of 5% carbon or 8% carbon, or whatever, that it's really everything's subject to the conditions that you're working in, the soil types that you've got.
Yeah, and just on that, we might as well get straight to the point. If you get a brochure that says they can help you get your soils to 8%, don't work with them. Simple as that.
Yeah, completely.
Because it's BS.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. So we'll keep coming back to that theme a bit more as we go through.
Yeah.
So I've had a look at the big emission kind of space as far as ag goes and all the different drivers in that system. When it comes to on-farm emissions, there's really a few key things that we need to be considering. As I mentioned, normal soil processes release greenhouse gases, and this includes the mineralisation of nitrogen from the organic matter into plant available forms. So it's really, it's kind of feels a bit like an oxymoron, but to have a really functional, healthy soil that is cycling nutrients well, is holding water and is doing all the good things, by default, that soil will have a higher microbial community, which means there's also higher emissions coming off that. What we need to keep in mind is that's not a massive part of our emission budget. We just need to acknowledge the fact that emissions aren't the be all and end all of our systems. It's actually one of the net emissions are kind of what we call a product of the systems that we work in. So I talked about nitrogen fertiliser, obviously a really big deal. And there's a lot of emphasis at the moment on the delivery options for this. Use of emission inhibitors, and look at different formulations, even how the fertiliser is created. So we know that most of the urea that we use in our systems is generated through the Haber-Bosch process, which is highly energy and CO2 intensive in terms of high rate of emissions in that process. There's some really cool new stuff coming through around how the fertiliser is actually made. And as those new products come online over the next 5 to 10 years, that in itself will be a major contributor to reductions in on-farm emissions. So that's really important. Diesel usage is an easy thing to think about when you think about emissions, because we know all engines have them, but it is a lower proportion of the system. If you can capture that data well, that's going to be of high value to you. That's really the 1% incremental value at the end. It's not one of the big levers that we talk about. Land use change is really important when it comes to greenhouse gas models, because every time we change land use historically over a 20-year period before the accounting time, that actually has implication in terms of how the emissions are modelled. So again, keeping records of differences in land use change will mean that if this was something that you had to contribute to in future, that you've got that information that you need. Something that currently working on in another piece of work is actually around refining these models for Australian conditions and recognising the value of moving in and out of pasture in these systems, rather than farmers receiving penalties for emission penalties for moving from a pasture phase to cropping. Because we know that in the long term, if we're in that rotation system, that pasture has really high impact. Burning versus trash retention is, there's obviously differences in the emissions there. The challenge is that when we retain trash, we still have CO2 emissions through microbial breakdown of those residues. So it's really a choice of what's best for your system as a whole. Burning does have a bigger impact, but it's really around, in the long term, what do you want your system to look like, and how do you kind of progress in that space?
So, Cass, just on burning, in an ideal world, it's in terms of emissions, a system without, or trying to get to net zero, a system without burning would be a better system, wouldn't it?
It would, yeah. And that's going to become so there's actually two things we need to think about there, Kate, in terms of the supply chain reporting and that, which we'll come to a bit later, is that there's the one thing around the actual emissions associated with the practice. With our trash retention, we have kind of a longer term CO2 emission profile from that as the microbes break down that residue. with the burning piece, there's less, the CO2 produced from that isn't accounted for, but the other gases that come out of that are. But the other thing that's getting more airplay now is companies and different players in this space are recognising that emissions will fluctuate according to year from seasonal conditions. So some of the key messages we're actually supporting is looking at the whole farm of practice, and to say, well, within this seasonal conditions, this is the kind of fluxing that you'd expect. But it's just as important to recognise farmers doing best practice, acknowledging what they're doing, not just what the numbers say. So from that perspective,
yep,
burning will definitely be less supported in future from a best practice perspective.
And I guess it's around putting burning in perspective, isn't it? So, and burning one paddock to reduce, say, a slug risk. I think we can live with that. It's perhaps it's worth thinking for the future in terms of capex and machinery, etc. As well, what do we do with stubble residue? What engineering solutions can we use to get through stubble rather than going the default, let's put the match in?
Yeah, I think we really need to keep burning as our strategic option.
Yeah.
For when we need it.
Yeah.
And I think the tolerance towards burning as a kind of social license thing, as much as that's term gives me the heebie-jeebies, it really is something that we need to keep that as an option. I think we need to be as smart as we possibly can around how we use that as a tool.
And would you say the same for cultivation?
I'd say cultivation is really like that strategic. If we keep that for our strategic intervention for when we need it. I think most farmers are probably more the other way. Although our mixed farmers coming in and out of pastures, obviously there's more of a role for cultivation in that space. But
because really cultivation does probably have one of the biggest impacts, doesn't it?
Well, it's funny, Australian systems in the long-term data, we're not seeing differences in carbon usage as much.
Okay.
Now that we've gone away from that continuous usage of cultivation,
yep,
as a strategic intervention once every few years, the impact
sit down.
is quite low. But yeah, so really just thinking long term, how do we progress to keep burning as our sort of strategic last option tool rather than a first option.
Craig, might just get you to mute if that's okay.
Then the other thing, we talked about nitrogen fertiliser, really big impact as far as our levers for emissions. When we talk about fertiliser in this space, we talk about the context of nitrogen use efficiency. So we're not saying just stop using nitrogen fertiliser, because we know that without adequate supplies of N, we're not going to get the plant productivity that we need. We're not going to grow that food. So it's really around how we can refine our decision making around nitrogen so that we get that, we keep on that yield response curve. If with increasing yields, increasing nitrogen, that all works. When we're increasing nitrogen, when we're not increasing yields, that's when the emission factors start to come into play.
Yeah, and just on that, I think we've got huge opportunities there to, with rotation for starters, and then judicious use of nitrogen. So just simply doing more deep ends. There's so much low-hanging fruit of things that we could be using that we don't use. And I suspect in the future, there'll be improvements in nitrogen use efficiency thanks to GM technology as well when it comes to varieties. But my mind thinks immediately, well, let's stop growing canola on cereal stubbles. The moment we do that and start having a rotation that goes legume, canola, then cereal, you'll immediately get a whole lot better nitrogen use efficiency in your system.
Yeah. completely.
Which might be heresy for New South Wales farming practices, but just saying.
We'll come back to that a bit later as well.
Yeah.
So I don't really want to dwell on the animal space at the moment, because the reductions of methane in animals is really around that, that feeding space, and obviously there's a lot to be done there. But just in terms of the accounting, there's a big impact on the number of days that animal is growing, particularly in intensive systems. So dairy, this is, well, not so much dairy, but you know, more the feedlot systems, that's really high impact. But apart from everything else, it's probably around what supplementation and that is possible. So the last thing on this slide is really around the soil carbon, and everything always comes back to soil carbon, but it's really around the role of that carbon in offsetting these on-farm emissions, which we'll talk through a bit more. Because just as an example, if we were to do an emission profile of a wheat crop, for example, and this is as a commodity, so what the attachment of emission footprint to that tonne of grain, if we keep everything the same in our system, and look, don't worry about the detail on this very much, I've just put the numbers there to demonstrate that it's actually credible, is that if we move that carbon from 1% carbon to 1.5% carbon, which is a massive jump in a lot of our systems, but just showing kind of at the high end what's possible, that would actually result in a 37% reduction in net emissions for that product going off farm, and also on a per hectare basis. So I've just put that up to demonstrate what a massive lever soil carbon is in their systems. So just something to keep that in mind. So the key thing really is that we talk about emissions in from the perspective of agriculture and that, but it really comes down to productivity though, doesn't it, Kate, in terms of our soils and what we're doing?
Oh, absolutely. Like productivity, and the biggest economic incentive, you know, preaching to the converted with this audience, is productivity drives profit. And we can't have productivity without soil health. And I think that's one of my messages to a broader audience, and something that each farmer can talk about to the broader audience and the non-agriculture audience, is there's more to soil health than soil carbon.
Yeah, it's a complete product. It's like a quadruple bottom line, really. Because if you're managing your soils by removing any constraints in that system to enable the best plant to grow, and you're feeding that plant and maintaining that fertility as you need to grow that plant and grow that food and grow that animal, if you're setting up your system to be as productive as possible, then by default that should support your profitability, unless you're actually tipping over the edge and overdoing things. But generally, productive systems, profitable systems, again, by default, if we're growing really good plants with really good root exploration, really good biomass growth, and doing everything right, then we're setting up that system for good microbial activity and soil function, which then means that we're supporting the maintenance or increase of soil carbon in those systems, which then means that we're actually setting up that system for a reduced emission footprint. So
yeah,
that's really, for me, the carbon and the emissions are the product of the system that you're working in.
They're one aspect of the whole system. And I think this is the thing to remember. And when I wrote the book, I spent quite a bit of time on this, about viewing the farm as a whole system, and acknowledging that it's a complex, messy system, part of other complex, messy systems. But when you strip it back to the basics, the potential for you to make money on your farm comes down to the climate that you're in, the quality of the soil and the landscape that you've got. Because obviously, you know, if you're stuck up on the mountain range, it's a bit hard to be growing canola, you know. So there's landscape limitations. And then, so amongst that climate and soil limitations, that basically gives you a farm productive capacity. And then it's up to you how you manage that and get the end result. And we know that through all the research that there's still a huge productivity gap in terms of true potential. And part of that productivity gap is soil constraints. So things like acidity in our region and sodicity, and obviously climate constraints like temperature and frost, and the dryland component, water, and I guess in the irrigation component, how efficiently you're using that water and cost effectively. So that's it in a nutshell. Farming's easy, really.
Pretty much. So the key things that we really want to look at it, as we mentioned, is really looking at what the most limiting factor is in your farming system. Until that's addressed, and then you move on to the next factor, the inputs that you put into that system aren't going to be well utilised. So in terms of efficiency of nutrient inputs and efficiency of water, that's really, you've got to think about, well, I'm putting on these other things, but what's stopping, productivity? Is why is my plant only still in the top 30 centimetres? Why is my root exploration poor? Why is my, I'm having to put heaps of water on to support a system that should actually be able to build up a bit of a bank of water rather than continuously having to feed it. So why aren't my roots growing? When we look at our nutrition, and we talk about soil fertility, is so important. We need good nutrition in our systems for our animals, we need it for our plants, and we also need it for our microbes. So if we don't have enough of these other elements in the system, we can't support soil carbon and we can't support organic matter turnover. And really what we're saying is what's good for plants is also good for microbes and also good for greenhouse gas reduction. But we really need to look at what our limitations are to our plant function to see why we may not be achieving what we want. So really looking at soil physical and chemical constraints for our microbial activity and also for our plants to grow. Key thing that as farmers we all know intuitively, but sometimes it's good just to call it out, is that food production is not a cycle, it's actually a linear export process. And so if we're not keeping track of what we need to maintain on farm and replace, then we actually end up in a mining system. And this replacement may not be putting in every year. It may be that you actually build up a bank that you then draw down, but you know that you need to keep topping it up to keep going.
Cass, I think there's a really good live example at the moment on that net export. Any of the audience that has been growing 4 tonne to the hectare faba bean crops recently may notice that if they're doing soil end tests, that the deep ends coming back after beans are a lot lower than we've come to expect. And the reason for that is instead of, we're exporting twice as much grain. We used to think in dryland, we used to think a 2 tonne bean crop was a good result, and we're getting 4 tonne in dryland in the last couple of years. So we're exporting twice as much material, and hence we're not leaving as much behind. So the more productive we get in terms of exporting material, we are mining the soil, and it's really important. And I was just wondering, can I be a bit controversial and ask you a question?
Bring it on.
One of the things I battle with is, or I've noticed in the literature and in the advertising brochures, that there's a lot of emphasis on words like, avoiding use of synthetic fertilizers to reduce your emissions, etc., etc. But if I look at this, if what's good for the microbes is the same as what's good for the plants, what's the risk of going down a carbon project path where you might, completely change your system and go away from using fertilizer?
you'll actually lose your carbon.
Say that again?
You'll actually lose your carbon.
Wow. Wow.
So you cannot.
That's scary.
So as an example, if we look at on the right-hand side on the slide, we can see, organic matter. There's carbon in that organic matter. But organic matter per se is also made up of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, hydrogen, oxygen, all these other things, because that is also in that organic material. Organic matter per se has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 10:1. So for every 10 units of carbon in the system, we need 1 unit of nitrogen to maintain that organic matter. As that organic matter depletes, our carbon depletes, right? So that means that every time we mineralise nitrogen from organic matter for plant uptake, that process actually results in the loss of carbon through CO2. We cannot maintain carbon in our organic matter without nitrogen.
Yeah, but what if I grow my own nitrogen through, having planting clover or other legumes in a cover crop?
So if you're fixed nitrogen in that system, you'll actually hold that carbon and everything well. But if you're still in a functional food production system and you're not supplying enough nitrogen for that plant to grow and that food that you're producing, then you will actually start to deplete the system. So the emphasis with inorganic fertiliser, so that the reason why inorganic fert or synthetic fert is an issue is the high energy cost and emission cost of production of that fertiliser. That's our key issue we have with it. So for every tonne of urea that's produced, there's 2 tonnes of CO2 produced in the manufacture of it. And the issue we have is that's part of the baggage, the emission baggage that comes with that nitrogen fertiliser.
Mm.
So that just means when we use it, we have to refine our use of it and get it sorted. But to say that we should be not supplying inorganic fertiliser under a carbon farming system is actually a very kind of knee-jerk kind of reaction. So
Yep.
We need to be maintaining our soil fertility through any means to do that. I'd advise, and we'll talk about this a bit more in a sec, but opportunities to increase your contribution of legume-derived nitrogen are always a good thing in your system. But making a commitment to remove that synthetic fertiliser from your system on the basis of a carbon farming project is very short-sighted.
And I guess phosphorus is the one that I think of, given our soils are so low in P naturally. But on the flip side, I can probably imagine, some of the systems, the natural sequence farming and so-called regen farming in a grazing system in the New South Wales highlands, where they've probably never had fertiliser in the past anyway, just increasing the management of those systems through rotation. They're probably improving them from what they were, but that's very different to taking that practice and trying to put it out into the riverine plains, isn't it?
Well, at the end of the day, nitrogen is the only nutrient that can be naturally, through microbial end fixation, brought back into the soil. Every other element we deal with comes from our soil stores, and Australian soil stores generally are really low in those nutrients.
Yeah.
The challenge is a lot of the literature in this space comes from America, which have very young, very fertile soils. So their ability to reduce their nutrient inputs and use natural cycles, like natural sequence farming and regen approaches to access that nutrient is completely different from us. So if we're not replacing the phosphorus, sulfur, potassium, everything else that we're taking out, then we come to a tipping point where that becomes the most limiting factor to hold our organic matter and grow plants.
So I suppose we'd have a few years of grace, would we, if we're a system that's been using fertiliser for, several years, like 100 years, and then change systems? I imagine it'd take a little while before we start to see the effect, the mining effect. Does it get masked in the first few years?
I would actually say a lot of our cropping systems at the moment are in a subclinical deficiency already.
Yeah, right.
We keep taking out big crops. We keep taking out a heap of milk, corn, silage, hay, all that
Yep.
stuff. So the fact that we've had a history of usage, but we've also had a big history of export. So I think you'd only do that based on very good soil testing and looking at the system.
Sure.
Okay,
So,
move on, I think.
yeah, sorry for hijacking it, but I just thought it was an important point to make.
No, completely. So if we come back to our irrigated ag again, just to put a bit of a spotlight on that. Kate, just in your thinking, what are some key differentiators in these systems when we're thinking about this climate risk and about the emission?
Yeah, sure. So I'll tackle this from two aspects, I guess. First, if we just think about soil carbon and the limitations on building soil carbon and the limitations on microbial activity, the two biggest limitations are temperature, apart from soil type itself, is temperature and water. So in theory, if we're able to irrigate, we're taking away one of those limitations. The reality, though, is that we don't always have access. So say that again. Am I going unstable?
You are, Kate.
Now.
Am I back?
You're back.
I might just pull my camera. I'll stop my video and just talk for a minute, just to be on the safe side.
Some notes as well in case we lose you.
Yeah, so sorry about that, folks. You wouldn't think that I live about 4 kilometres from a major regional city, would you, with our connectivity? But that's the way of the world. Yeah, so as I was saying, I think in theory, having water there is fantastic in terms of being able to maintain our system. But the reality is we don't always have that water. And also we are, high, where we've got, say, yield targets of 10 tonne of wheat, that also requires higher inputs. And there's still this mental barrier in terms of those higher inputs that I don't think, we can always get over. I think when I think of irrigation, I'm probably more thinking also about the energy required in the irrigation system. And I suppose the opportunities and the risks involved in that. Obviously, it costs, it takes fuel or electricity or some sort of power to run these systems. And particularly as we're moving away from flood irrigation into more mechanised systems. And I guess there's opportunities there with precision ag to actually be more precise about how we use our water.
Yeah.
And we know from all the Irrigated Cropping Council seminars in the past that there's huge opportunity, all the work that Sam North's done and the guys at Tatura, there's enormous opportunity to fine tune our water use efficiency in irrigation. Cass, do you want to just pop onto the next slide? I just put this slide in here to demonstrate, and you guys will know this all too well, but ultimately our ability to irrigate depends on water supply. And at the moment, the last time we had water supply like this was after the 2010-11 floods. And then it wasn't, when I first shifted to the area, I think the price of water was around $140 a meg. And then of course it shot up again once the New South Wales drought hooked in. So we're always going to be at the bequest of nature. Whenever we have a drought in New South Wales and southern Queensland, we don't have water down here. All other constraints and politics aside, that's ultimately the pattern. And if this graph went back to 1997, it'd be low. So while there's opportunities in irrigation, in theory, I think when it comes to building soil carbon, water is still a constraint in the whole farm system.
Yeah. And we might just keep ticking on a bit.
Yeah, sure.
We could sit here and chew the fat all day, really. But if we just keep kind of shooting through a bit, so we can focus a bit at the end around what to do next, is it's really we just wanted to flag why supply chain companies are interested in the emission space. And really it comes down to the fact that there's this thing called Scope 3, which is looking at the emission footprint associated with everything that goes into the factories. So for our food companies, this could be up to 70 to 80% of our total footprint, which means it's a big deal for them. So as they continue to reduce their energy usage in factories, they still need to start getting some reductions downstream for them in order to get a substantial drop. And to put this in context as well, farmers also have what's called Scope 3 emissions, which is what's involved in the manufacture of the products used on farm. So that's something that those companies before farmers are also looking at as well to reduce that footprint. So I might just chug on a bit, but just to flag, every company will have Scope 3 emission commitments. As much as we'd like to say this is your problem, it's not ours, it's not, tough luck, you're the food manufacturer, you deal with it. End of the day, every company in that whole supply chain has to start demonstrating this. So as farmers, we have a choice of either getting our ducks in line to make that work for us as much as possible, or we can sit back and just kind of say not going to participate, in which case then you end up being having to react to that environment around you, which we'll go through a bit more. Now, we don't really have time to work through the whole carbon market stuff as such, but really just, I guess with this, we just wanted to say that while net zero is very much an on-farm thing, there's this whole carbon market stuff at play as well. And really just I think I really like how you class this, Kate, as a very young carbon market in terms of the perceived simplicity of the systems. Is that what you?
Yeah, so I guess the key points on the carbon market is that it's complex, commercial and contractual, and that's the thing to remember. If you dip your toe into the regulated carbon market and you sign a contract, you're committed. It's a commercial market, so people are in there to make money along the supply chain. They see the carbon supply chain, they see this as an opportunity. So carbon aggregators aren't your friend. Let's be clear about that. Carbon aggregators see an opportunity and they're taking a big clip along the way. Some carbon aggregators have more of a scientific understanding of the complexity of carbon than others. And so there's just a lot of murk there at the moment because it's a very young market. So it's a bit like when wheat varieties stopped being released by the government and started being released by commercial companies. If you remember the amount of canola varieties that came online and then the amount of wheat varieties, there was a lot of crap released early. And this is going to be the same. There's going to be a lot of crap put in front of you early on, and you just have to be really judicious before you commit to anything.
And really just to flag that as far as the carbon market's concerned, it's basically carbon is considered as a single entity black box with a dollar sign on it. Whereas as farmers, and in farming, we know that it's actually a complex fluxing entity that exists within a dynamic fluxing entity that exists within a dynamic farming system. So there's just massive challenges with that. So really just to flag where we're up to, and just apologies, Kate, we'll just skip through a few things quickly because I see we're running out of time.
Yeah, sure.
But as we've been saying, we've got thresholds of soil carbon in our systems. A lot of our good farmers are already on the high end of that curve. And at the same time, there's this increasing pressure to demonstrate carbon neutrality or a net zero footprint to sell commodities. You cannot sell carbon as a carbon credit into the carbon market and also report on that carbon through your supply chain. So this is called double dipping against the same bank. This is really important because if you decide to sign a contract on a carbon trading scheme, and then you cannot use that carbon to offset your own emissions, you'll actually end up with a really high net emission footprint, which means that you may actually be locked out of certain markets because of that in future. So I guess it really comes back to, what does this net zero mean? At a really high context level, it's just really around what our total emissions are on our farm, looking at everything that we've talked about before, minus our total net offsets, which gives you a net emission. The concept is that if these net emissions calculations are either zero or negative, then you can say that you're a net zero. The challenge is that, and this can be done through a farming system approach or through a commodity approach, but at the moment there is no common methodology in this space, which comes back to our wonderful world of farming and the world of incomplete information.
Cass, can I just jump in there?
Yeah, sure.
Just quickly, I think the key to this is the farming systems approach. And if each of you think about your farm and where your crappiest bits of soil are, and the bits that are hard, like they're either too wet or too dry, if you take them out of production, some of those bits out of production, and put them into timber or perennial pastures, things like that, that's where you're going to have the biggest impact. And there will be opportunity in biodiversity grants, and there might be opportunity in carbon projects. But even for yourself with a biodiversity grant, you'll make an enormous difference if you really think about your natural capital and where you can add vegetation into that.
Completely. So it's all about what you can do for your system, for your benefit. That's really where it comes down to. So I guess knowing that we've got that incomplete information, we've got some actions on what you can do about this, and but really it's a lot of it's around attitude and perception as well. Now, just before we go on, Belinda, I know we're kind of running out of time.
Yes.
Happy if we run for another 5? Or do
well, I've been asking people if they have any questions to come forward and put their hand up. We've got one here. Stuart Hodges asked if we can sow carbon in the soil. So I think we can keep on going if people would like to stay for another few minutes, and if they've got any questions, sort of put them forward and we'll go through them as well. Can we do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm enjoying this. Thank you.
So Kate, how do we deal with the fact that we're running this incomplete information as far as net zero goes?
Yeah, so certainly, staying informed. So I'd say Belinda's just put Richard Eckard's podcast in the chat box. Most Department of Ag websites, certainly the Victorian one, has a really good link on this whole area. of stuff. Grain growers have a great booklet out called Carbon. I can't remember what it's called actually, but there's a lot of, my point is there's a lot of really good mainstream information that we can delve into, and but acceptance is the first thing, and I think we're there now. Now that, and I suppose going back to the big picture again, the reason this has become back to our attention in the last 12 months is because that finally our government has committed to net zero. So we're in a hurry now. We don't have the luxury of waiting for the exact science, because the market pressure and the political pressure is there. So we just have to get on with it. And if we just go to the action slide, Cass. So what I'd be doing, and what I am doing on our little farm is, well, I don't have any CapEx on my little farm, but thinking already about what's the CapEx plan for the future. What's my 20-year CapEx plan? And I think because this is market driven and every company has a carbon account and a greenhouse gas emission account, the technology is coming. We'll have green on green spraying very quickly, very affordably. We'll have electric tractors or hydrogen energy options very soon. I wouldn't be surprised, Cass, if the ammonium on-farm ammonium production comes within the next 10 years, or at least the next 20. So we're going to have, you'll have opportunities. So I guess the first thing is don't worry too much, because stuff will come on the market to help reduce your emissions. We've already talked about productive, healthy soils. That's the thing that you can control the most. So stick to what you can control. Be alert, not alarmed, stay aware, don't wrestle with pigs because you get dirty and they enjoy it. You can control your systems. We are notoriously bad record keepers. We are crap at it. And that's one thing that we can get better at. And if we start now and put systems in place, when we do have to really hook into this stuff, you'll be ready. And farming is the art of decision making with incomplete information. So don't stress about that, because we're good at it. We're better at it than anyone else.
I'd completely go with that. So then when we talk about these best bet strategies and just build on what we're talking about then, is really just fleshing that out a bit more and talking about your focus on your profitable, sustainable farming systems. That's the key. Carbon and emissions are a product of those systems. They're not a driver. Work on identifying new constraints, manage your risk in your diversity of rotations and enterprise. As Kate said, keep your good records. This is gold. I know it's a pain in the butt. I know we all hate doing it, but it's the best asset that you can generate in terms of the future in this space. The future of emission reporting and net zero and supply chain emission, scope 3 emission reporting is all around records. So the better evidence you've got, the more of a place of comfort you'll be in. If you're soil testing, record your GPS locations, which will give you most sensitivity to determine if you're making change on farm. If you're not soil testing, consider establishing some of these baseline monitoring sites for yourself for carbon and nutrients, not for a carbon trading platform, but just for yourself. Work on your big levers, which we know that nitrogen is the largest single emission factor and carbon is the largest single emission offset factor. So they're the two biggest levers in your system. As much as feasible and economical and profitable, consider expanding the contribution of legume-derived N in the system, not just around the emissions, but also around the risk associated with price and volatility of that, and just reducing your exposure in that. As new sources of nitrogen come online in the next 10 years, as Kate mentioned, this will all change. But building up that organic nitrogen bank in your system is a really good way to de-risk not just your emission factors, but also your whole farming system.
So I've got a rule of thumb on that, Cass. If you can get a legume in there 1 in 5, preferably, and 1 in 7, it makes an enormous difference to your nitrogen use efficiency based on the research because of the better microbial function. So often we think, well, what does that mean? And I just think if you can think about 1 in 5 or 1 in 7, it'll make a huge difference.
Completely, yeah. Okay.
So Cass, there's a question there about carbon calculators.
Yes, there are some in play at the moment. The challenge is we don't have standards. Depends on the detail you want to go down.
Is the Melbourne Uni one, is the Richard Eckard one the best one at the moment?
The Richard Eckard one is the best helicopter view, or 3,000 foot view. So that's kind of good if you want to just play around and just see what happens as you toggle some numbers to see what impact that has on your system. The challenge with the Melbourne Uni one is it's set up for a whole of farm thing. So you put in one number for all your cropping and one number for all your livestock. So it doesn't give the granularity that's needed for a product report in terms of supply chain reporting or anything.
Yep.
But it is probably a good thing just to have a bit of a play around with and just to see what your big impact in your system is. The last thing I wanted to really flag was data ownership and sharing. This is really important. As farmers, you get asked to move a lot of information around, and it's always for someone else's benefit. So really think twice before you share any of your information. Read the fine print around if you move information through a supply chain or something else, can you still use that information yourself for other purposes? Like, what's the exclusivity on that? And really, the better your record keeping is, the better your your soil testing and stuff to understand what your basic carbon and everything is sitting at. That's value for you. So don't give that away lightly, and look to see exactly where your information's being shared. So that's probably a good place to finish. And Belinda, so sorry we've gone over time. It's always a bit of a challenge when we get stuck into some conversation.
No, I found it incredibly interesting, and thank you so much, Cassandra and Kate, and also to the Goulburn Broken Catchment Management Authority for their support through the funding of the Australian Government's National Landcare program for making this session possible. I think it's a topic that we all hear about, we all sort of have a vague understanding, and for me, you've clarified some areas and certainly given me some things to think about. If you have any more questions that you'd like me to follow up on, send them to me. My email is on our website, and I think it was also in the invitation. Can I ask you to take one moment to complete the poll? There's one feedback question at the bottom, and that will just give us an opportunity to provide feedback to our stakeholders. Thank you for your attendance. I hope you have a really great day, and you have got something out of this session.
And thank you very much, Belinda, for hosting. And as I mentioned, I'll send through the PDF of that presentation, and feel free to circulate that on.
And we'll have a recording up on the website as well.
Perfect.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you all.
Have a great day.